The sun set over Dubai's skyline, casting a warm, golden glow over the sprawling metropolis. The city's towering skyscrapers, rich with glass and steel, gleamed under the fading light, as if they were part of some grand illusion. Beneath the surface of this perfect picture, however, lived a darker reality. It was a world where power and wealth blurred the lines between right and wrong, and where betrayal could strike from the most unexpected places. In a lavish villa on the outskirts of the city, the pulse of opulence was ever present. The smell of expensive perfumes hung in the air, mingling with the soft hum of a private pool's fountain. The villa, adorned with marble floors and intricately designed arches, was home to one of Dubai's wealthiest men, Kamil al-Hakim. At 52 years old, Kamil had built an empire, his name synonymous with luxury, status, and power. But beneath the polished surface of his wealth, Kamil's life was far from perfect. Kamil's wife, Layla al-Farsi, was a woman of undeniable beauty and grace. At 34, she had everything any woman could wish for: fame, fortune, and a life of luxury. Her raven-black hair cascaded down her back, framing a face that could stop anyone in their tracks. Yet Layla was more than just the trophy wife of a billionaire. She was a woman haunted by her own desires, her own loneliness, and the weight of expectations that came with her position. While Kamil's empire flourished, Layla found herself trapped in a gilded cage, her every move monitored, her every decision scrutinized. Her marriage, once filled with passion and promise, had grown cold over the years. The love had faded, replaced by a hollow partnership built on appearances. Kamil, a man of ambition and control, kept his private life just as meticulously crafted as his business empire. He was a man of secrets, always in control, always on top. But even the most powerful men have their flaws, and Kamil's was his need to control everything and everyone around him, especially Layla. As his wealth grew, so did his sense of entitlement. He believed Layla belonged to him, not just as a wife but as a possession. He was blind to her growing resentment, to the longing in her eyes whenever she gazed out the villa's windows at the city below. It was within the walls of that villa that Layla's life began to change, her desperation growing stronger with each passing day. She had sought solace in the arms of a man who was not her husband, a man whose very presence ignited a flame within her that had long been extinguished. Omar al-Rashid, a man in his late 30s, was Kamil's personal bodyguard. His tall, athletic frame stood as a silent protector, always just a step behind Kamil, guarding him like a shadow. Omar had been with Kamil for years, his loyalty unquestioned. But behind his stoic exterior lay a man with a quiet intensity, a man who had his own demons to battle. Their affair had begun in secret, an escape from the suffocating life Layla had been living. Omar, with his sharp eyes and understanding smile, made her feel alive again. He was everything Kamil was not: attentive, caring, and, most importantly, present. The chemistry between them was undeniable, and in the shadows of the grand villa, they found solace in each other's arms. But in a world where power was everything, their love was a dangerous game. Kamil had no idea that his wife and his most trusted bodyguard had been meeting in the quiet of the night, whispering promises of a life beyond the gilded cage. Layla's heart had begun to drift, and Omar, too, had started to imagine a life with her. A life free from the shadows of power and control. They had both dreamed of it, even if the cost of those dreams seemed too high to bear. For months, Layla and Omar had lived this double life, the tension between them mounting with each stolen moment. Layla had never felt more alive, yet at the same time, she knew that the walls were closing in around them. She couldn't keep this secret forever. Every day, the risk of being caught grew. And in Kamil's world, betrayal was not just a heartbreak, it was a death sentence. As time went on, the once vibrant life in the villa began to feel suffocating. Layla's smiles were forced, her laughter hollow. Kamil, though oblivious to the affair, began to sense that something was off. His once unshakable confidence wavered, replaced by a nagging unease. He began to keep a closer eye on Layla, watching her more carefully, scrutinizing her every move. His world of control was slipping, and he couldn't understand why. The turning point came one evening, when Layla and Omar's secret meeting was nearly discovered. Kamil, suspicious of his wife's behavior, had hired a private investigator to follow her. He knew something was wrong, even if he couldn't put his finger on it. The investigator's report had been inconclusive, but the seed of doubt had been planted in Kamil's mind. He began to monitor Layla more closely, tracking her every move, and slowly but surely, the tension between them grew unbearable. Layla, sensing Kamil's increasing paranoia, knew their time was running out. She and Omar had spoken of running away together, leaving everything behind. But the stakes were higher than they had imagined. In a world where wealth and power ruled, there was no such thing as a clean escape. The price of their freedom would be steep, and they both knew it. As the story unfolded, it was clear that the shadows of betrayal were creeping closer, tightening their grip around all involved. Power, trust, and morality were about to clash in ways none of them could have predicted. What Layla and Omar didn't realize, though, was how deep Kamil's obsession with control ran. In the end, the cost of their secret love would be more than any of them could bear. The villa, once a symbol of affluence and beauty, now felt like a ticking time bomb. The world outside, so vibrant and full of life, now seemed distant, a cruel reminder of the freedom Layla and Omar would never know. As the days passed, the walls grew higher, the tension more palpable. And in the quiet moments of the villa, as the wind whispered through the open windows, it was clear that something dark was about to unfold, something that would change all their lives forever. The villa, once a haven of luxury, now felt more like a pressure cooker, every moment steeped in an oppressive silence that hung over the three of them: Kamil, Layla, and Omar. As the days passed, the facade of normalcy slowly crumbled, revealing the cracks in the fragile relationships that held their world together. What had begun as whispers of discontent, as stolen glances and moments of passion, was now becoming a volatile cocktail of jealousy, obsession, and unspoken resentment. The walls of Kamil's empire were closing in, and with every passing day, it became clearer that something would have to give. Layla could feel it in her bones. The pressure was mounting. The guilt, once a nagging whisper in the back of her mind, had now become a constant roar. She no longer recognized the woman she had become. The lavish life she once adored had turned into a daily battle of survival, with each move calculated, each word chosen carefully. Kamil's once loving gaze had turned cold, and his quiet suspicion was now a constant presence in her life. The man who had once promised to adore her had grown distant and controlling, an invisible hand around her throat, tightening with every passing day. One evening, as Layla stood in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting the silk dress she was wearing for an event Kamil had insisted they attend, she caught her own reflection. Her eyes were tired, her smile forced. She barely recognized herself. The carefree woman who had once reveled in the spotlight, the envy of all who looked at her, was now a prisoner of her own making. And it wasn't just Kamil's watchful eye that wore her down. It was the secret she could never shake. Omar. Omar had become both her salvation and her curse. He was the only person who made her feel alive again, the only person who truly saw her. Every stolen moment with him felt like a dangerous escape, but the danger was escalating, and they both knew it. Kamil's growing suspicions were a constant weight on their shoulders, and Layla couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep up the charade. Every day, it felt like a new piece of the puzzle was falling into place, and the truth was inching closer to the surface. The night of the charity gala marked a turning point in their twisted triangle. Kamil was as charming as ever, his presence commanding attention as he worked the room, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with the city's most influential figures. But Layla's mind was elsewhere, her thoughts drifting to the man who wasn't beside her. Omar had stayed behind at the villa, his duties keeping him away from the event, but Layla could feel his absence keenly. As she scanned the crowd, her eyes locked onto Kamil's, and for a fleeting moment, she saw a flash of possessiveness in his gaze. It was a look that sent a shiver down her spine, reminding her just how far he would go to maintain control over her. When they returned home that night, Camille was more agitated than usual. He could sense the tension between them, could feel the strain in the air. Layla had been distant, her mind clearly elsewhere, and he wasn't blind to the way her eyes would flicker nervously when she thought he wasn't looking. It was a game to him now. He had to break her, to remind her that she was his and his alone. The thought of losing her to another man, especially someone as inconsequential as his own bodyguard, gnawed at him. Camille wasn't used to losing, and he wouldn't allow it to happen. "What's going on with you, Layla?" Camille's voice was low, almost too calm, but the tension in his words was unmistakable. He had been asking her this question for days, but she always deflected, always had an answer, a smile to cover up her discomfort. Tonight, however, she didn't answer right away. She felt trapped in his gaze, unable to break free from the intensity of it. "I'm fine, Camille," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. She tried to smile, but it felt hollow, like a mask she was struggling to keep in place. "You're not fine. I can see it. What's going on?" Camille's eyes narrowed, his suspicion growing. The silence between them was suffocating. Layla's heart pounded in her chest as she fought to maintain her composure. She couldn't let him know, couldn't let him discover the truth. Not yet. But Camille wasn't a man who took kindly to secrets, especially ones that threatened his control. He had always been the one in charge, the one who knew everything, and now that grip was slipping. "Nothing's going on," Layla said, her voice growing firmer, though she could hear the tremor of fear beneath it. "I just need some time to myself." Camille didn't buy it. He knew her too well. He had seen this change in her before, when she was unhappy, when she was hiding something. He was a man of action, and he couldn't stand the thought of being out of control. His mind began to race, calculating his next move. He didn't trust her anymore, and the thought of her with someone else, especially with Omar, sent a rush of jealousy through his veins, a jealousy he had never experienced before. The following days were marked by an escalating tension that neither Layla nor Omar could ignore. The guilt that had once been an undercurrent of their affair had now grown into something unbearable. Layla found herself growing increasingly paranoid, her every glance at Omar feeling like an open secret. She couldn't hide her feelings for him any longer, and neither could he. Their stolen moments were becoming harder to keep secret, and with each passing day, the risk grew. But it wasn't just their secret that was weighing on them. The outside world was closing in too. Camille's business empire was starting to face challenges. Competition was rising, and with the political climate in the region shifting, it was harder than ever to maintain control. Layla could see the strain in his face, the way he was constantly preoccupied with calls and meetings. But even as the pressure of his empire grew, Camille's obsession with his wife's loyalty became all-consuming. One evening, as Layla and Omar shared a quiet dinner at the villa, a knock on the door shattered the calm. It was a delivery, a letter from Camille's business partners. As Layla opened the envelope, her hands trembled. It was a legal notice, a warning that the situation was becoming dire. The pressure on Camille was mounting, and it was only a matter of time before that pressure broke him. As Layla glanced at Omar, she saw the same fear reflected in his eyes. They were both trapped in a game they no longer controlled. With every passing day, the web of lies and deceit grew tighter. Camille's temper became more unpredictable, his accusations more pointed. Layla and Omar both knew they were running out of time, but neither of them knew how to stop the storm that was about to break. The tension between them was now palpable, and every glance, every word, felt like a spark waiting to ignite. The quiet facade of their lives was about to crumble, and the fallout would be catastrophic. Camille's obsession, Layla's desperation, and Omar's hidden loyalties were all drawing them toward a breaking point, one that would change everything. The night was oppressive, thick with tension, as if the very air itself knew what was about to unfold. The villa, which had once been a symbol of wealth and luxury, now felt like a pressure chamber, its walls closing in on the three of them. Camille's suspicion had reached its peak, and the storm he had been waiting for was finally breaking. The subtle cracks in his control had now turned into gaping wounds, and the fragile veneer of normalcy had shattered beyond repair. Layla couldn't breathe. The guilt that had once clung to her like a shadow had turned into something more suffocating. An overwhelming weight that pressed against her chest. She had never imagined it would come to this. She had hoped, prayed even, that somehow they would be able to escape, to leave the suffocating grip of Camel's empire behind. But there was no way out now. No clean escape. Camel had figured it out. The moment of reckoning had arrived. It had been a quiet evening, too quiet. Camel had been unusually silent during dinner. The conversation between him and Layla strained and hollow. He hadn't looked at her the way he used to, with affection, with admiration. But instead, there was only coldness in his eyes. The weight of his gaze made Layla feel naked, as if he could see right through her, as if he knew every secret she had buried deep inside. Omar, ever the protector, had been stationed outside the villa, his figure blending into the shadows as he kept his distance, always watching, always waiting. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it, the tension thick in the air. And then it happened. Layla had been in the study, scrolling through her phone, lost in her thoughts, when Camel had walked in. The door slammed shut behind him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Layla felt fear creep up her spine. The man who had once been the love of her life, the man who had promised her the world, was now a stranger to her. She could see it in his eyes. Something had broken inside him, something irreversible. "What's going on, Layla?" Camel's voice was low, tight, each word dripping with accusation. "What have you been hiding from me?" Layla's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the walls closing in around her, and the weight of her lies, of the affair with Omar, came crashing down all at once. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny it all, but the words wouldn't come. Camel had already pieced it together. He had already figured out the truth. "I trusted you," Camel's voice cracked, the anger in his words cutting deeper than anything she had ever imagined. "And you betrayed me." With him, he spat the words like they were poison. The very air between them seemed to crackle with the raw intensity of his fury, and Layla felt her stomach churn. She knew what he was capable of. She had seen it in the cold, calculated way he ran his empire, in the way he controlled everything and everyone around him. But she had never seen him like this before. "I never wanted this," Layla whispered, her voice shaking. "I was lonely, Camel. I was suffocating in this marriage. You," she broke off, tears welling up in her eyes. "You changed. You stopped seeing me. And I needed someone. Omar was there for me." Camel's face twisted with rage. "Omar, my bodyguard, my trusted man." His voice dripped with disgust. He took a step closer, his face contorting with a mixture of jealousy and betrayal. "You're nothing but a whore." The word stung, but Layla didn't flinch. She had heard worse from Camel before. This was different, though. This was no longer about love or even hatred, it was about control. Camel would not accept being betrayed, especially not by someone as close to him as Omar. And Layla knew deep down that this was the point of no return. Her eyes flickered toward the door. She could almost hear Omar outside, waiting. But she knew it was useless. She had no way out. Camel had cornered her, trapped her in a cage of his making. "You think you can just leave me?" Camel's voice was low now, venomous, as he advanced on her. "You think you can betray me and walk away without consequences? I never wanted to hurt you." "Camel," Layla cried, stepping back, her heart racing. "But I can't live like this anymore. I can't be your prisoner." His eyes narrowed, and in that moment, Layla saw something cold and unfeeling flicker in his gaze. The man who had once been her partner, her lover, was gone. In his place stood a man consumed by anger, by a need to possess, to control. "I'll show you what happens to those who betray me," Camel said, his voice low and dangerous. Before Layla could react, before she could scream or run, Camel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, gleaming object, something she hadn't seen before. It was a knife. His hand trembled, not with fear, but with rage. Layla's breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back, instinctively trying to put some distance between them. "Camel, please," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't do this." But Camel was beyond reasoning now. His eyes were wide with fury, his every movement jerky, erratic. He lunged at her, and in that split second, Layla's body froze. The world seemed to slow down as she saw the blade flash in the dim light. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she barely registered the pain when it came, the cold steel slicing through her skin. She gasped, stumbling back, her hands instinctively clutching at the wound, the blood warm and sticky on her fingers. Camel's face was twisted, his breathing ragged. He stood over her, the knife still in his hand, the blood dripping from the tip. Layla's vision blurred as she fell to the floor, her body heavy and cold. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to focus on his face. But it was fading fast. "You thought you could escape me," Camel muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "But you're mine. Always." And then, just as quickly as it had started, it was over. In the aftermath, the villa was eerily silent. Camel stood over Layla's lifeless body, his hand trembling as he wiped the blood from his face. His chest heaved with each breath, his mind spinning with the reality of what he had just done. There was no going back now, no hiding from the truth. He had killed her. The woman he had once loved, the woman who had betrayed him, was dead, and it was his doing. Panic set in. His mind raced, searching for a way out, for a way to cover up the mess he had made. He couldn't afford to be caught, to let the truth come out. He had worked too hard for everything he had, his empire, his power, and he wouldn't let it all slip away because of a moment of weakness. The door creaked open, and Omar stepped into the room. His eyes widened in shock as he took in the scene before him, the blood, the lifeless body of Layla. His heart sank. He had been too late. The two men stood in the middle of the room, each locked in a moment of disbelief. Camel's mind raced, but Omar's was clear. They had both crossed a line they could never uncross. In the days that followed the crime, a heavy silence settled over the villa, thick and suffocating. Camel, his mind swirling with a mixture of guilt, fear, and disbelief, had done everything in his power to maintain control over the narrative. The first few hours after Layla's death had been spent in frantic motion, cleaning, hiding, and covering up. But even in his meticulous efforts, the weight of what he had done gnawed at him like a relentless parasite. No amount of money, no amount of power, could erase the haunting image of Layla's lifeless form sprawled across the floor, her blood staining the very place they had once shared their lives together. He had never been a man to show weakness, but now, the cracks in his facade were becoming impossible to ignore. Every time he closed his eyes, the memories of that moment flooded him. The rage, the knife, and the final, defiant look in Layla's eyes before everything went dark. The reality of the crime was setting in, and with it came the crushing weight of remorse, though Camel would never admit it aloud. He couldn't help but think of Omar, standing there in the aftermath, frozen in disbelief. His bodyguard, his confidant. He had never imagined that their bond would be tested in such a way. Omar had always been the silent one, the protector in the shadows. But now he was tied to the crime, his silence as damning as Camel's own. They were in this together, trapped by their actions, by their shared guilt. Omar, for his part, had been struggling just as much, though his emotions were more concealed, buried beneath layers of stoic resolve. He couldn't shake the image of Layla's body, the finality of it all, and the growing realization that he had played a part in her death. He had helped Layla escape, had given her the illusion of safety, but in the end, he couldn't protect her from the man who claimed to love her. The shame burned in his chest, and yet, a part of him still felt justified. He had been the one who had suffered the most, had spent years hiding in the shadows, watching the love of his life slip further away. Layla's death, while tragic, was not without reason. It had been a long time coming, a culmination of years of neglect and emotional abandonment. But even as he justified it to himself, he couldn't escape the creeping sense of guilt that wrapped around his soul. The world outside, however, didn't know any of this. To the public, Camel was still the wealthy, powerful businessman. the man who owned half of Dubai, who had built an empire from nothing. His name was synonymous with success, with wealth, with influence. The news of Layla's death would be carefully spun, sanitized for public consumption. The media, ever eager to protect the powerful, had quickly painted the tragedy as a domestic dispute gone wrong, a story of a love gone awry. No one would know the true extent of what had happened behind closed doors. The affair, the manipulation, the control, those were the details that would never see the light of day. Instead, the headlines would focus on the tragic end of a marriage that had once been the envy of the world. But the public perception, however carefully curated, was not enough to keep the truth at bay forever. The cracks were beginning to show. Kamal's public appearances became fewer, his every move scrutinized by the press, by the public who had once adored him. Whispers began to spread through the circles of power in Dubai, and slowly, Kamal's reputation, carefully crafted over decades, began to unravel. People started to ask questions, to wonder about the circumstances surrounding Layla's death. And while Kamal still held the reins of his empire, the foundation beneath him was beginning to tremble. No amount of money could buy back the trust he had lost, and the guilt that gnawed at his conscience became louder with each passing day. Omar, too, was feeling the consequences. While Kamal's actions were hidden behind a veil of privilege and power, Omar's position was far more precarious. He was the outsider, the man who had never truly belonged to Kamal's world, and now he was exposed. Rumors began to circulate about his involvement in Layla's death, whispers of betrayal and murder. In the weeks that followed, he found himself a pariah, his every movement watched, his every action questioned. The guilt weighed heavily on him, but there was no one to confide in, no one who could understand the complexities of what had happened. He had lost Layla, and in many ways he had lost himself too. The love that had once burned so brightly between them had turned to ash, leaving him with nothing but a deep, gnawing emptiness. For the families involved, the fallout was devastating. Layla's family, already estranged from her for years, was rocked by the news of her death. They had never approved of her marriage to Kamal, had always seen him as a man driven by power and wealth, blinded by his own ego. But they had never imagined that their daughter's life would end in such a brutal and senseless way. They were left to pick up the pieces, mourning a woman they had never truly known, a woman who had lived her life in the shadows, too afraid to speak out, too afraid to leave the man who had claimed her as his own. The grief they felt was mixed with anger, a bitter, festering rage at the man who had taken their daughter away from them. They were determined to seek justice, to expose the truth no matter the cost. The community at large, too, was shaken. Dubai had always been a place of wealth, power, and excess, where the rich and powerful played by their own rules. But the murder of Layla Al-Farsi, a woman so intimately tied to the city's elite, rocked the very foundation of the glittering world that had once seemed untouchable. The public was divided. Some whispered that Kamal was guilty, while others, more loyal to the man who had built so much, continued to defend him. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would come out. As for Kamal, the aftermath of the crime left him in a state of perpetual unease. He continued to run his empire with the same ruthless precision, but his mind was elsewhere. The guilt was a constant presence, a shadow that hung over every decision he made, every deal he struck. He had gotten away with it for now, but the repercussions were far from over. The truth, no matter how carefully buried, had a way of clawing its way to the surface. Kamal knew that, deep down, the consequences were inevitable. The story of Layla's death, like all tragedies, would leave its mark on everyone involved. But for Kamal, for Omar, and for those who had been caught in the web of lies and betrayal, the emotional toll would be lasting. Some would break under the weight of their guilt, others would justify their actions, but none would emerge unscathed. The world they had known, the world of wealth and power, of carefully constructed facades, had been irrevocably changed. And as the days passed, as the grief and guilt continued to fester, the question lingered. Was it worth it? The consequences of the crime unfolded in the way that only the most tragic of stories could, slowly, irrevocably, and with no chance of turning back. The once glittering world that Kamil al-Farsi had built came crashing down around him. His empire, based on a foundation of wealth, power, and manipulation, now seemed fragile. In the days that followed Layla's murder, the legal system began to take its course, albeit slowly. At first, the whispers and rumors about the circumstances of her death remained nothing more than that, whispers. But with the mounting pressure from Layla's family and the ever-growing public interest, the case gained traction, eventually forcing authorities to confront the reality that Kamil might not be the untouchable figure he once appeared to be. Kamil's life, once defined by his wealth and influence, had been irrevocably altered. The shock of Layla's death was not just emotional, it was financial. A relentless investigation into his assets and the shadowy dealings behind his empire began, fueled by the media's insatiable thirst for scandal. Kamil, who had always operated with a sense of superiority, now found himself navigating a world where even his vast wealth couldn't shield him from the consequences of his actions. He was forced to sell off parts of his business empire to pay off mounting legal bills, and though his lawyers fought fiercely to protect his reputation, it became clear that the public perception had shifted. Once seen as a symbol of power, Kamil now became a cautionary tale of greed, infidelity, and the dark side of human ambition. In the end, Kamil was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his wife. The trial was a media circus, with every detail of the crime laid bare for the world to see. The courtroom became a stage for the unfolding drama of his rise and fall, with prosecutors presenting the case against him and defense attorneys scrambling to maintain his innocence. Though Kamil never showed any remorse for what he had done, the weight of his conviction was clear. He had once been untouchable, but now he was just another man, broken, defeated, and confined to the harsh reality of his actions. In prison, his life became a shadow of what it had been. The once proud billionaire now faced each day with the crushing knowledge that the world he had spent his entire life building was gone. Omar, too, faced the consequences of his involvement. His role in the crime, while less direct, was no less damning. The revelation of his affair with Layla and his involvement in the plot to murder Kamil sent shockwaves through the community. His once stoic demeanor, the calm exterior that had earned him respect as Kamil's trusted bodyguard, was now shattered. His loyalty to Kamil, which had once seemed unshakable, was called into question, and his connection to Layla, once a forbidden secret, was now the subject of public scrutiny. Omar, like Kamil, was arrested, though he was sentenced to a lesser term. In prison, he was forced to confront the truth about his relationship with Layla, the betrayals that had led to her death, and the deep emptiness that lingered in his heart. He was haunted by the knowledge that he had never truly been the protector he had imagined himself to be, and the weight of Layla's death consumed him. Layla's family, too, saw their lives changed. They had long been estranged from her, having never fully understood her life with Kamil. Her death, however, brought them together in a way they had never expected. They filed civil lawsuits against Kamil, hoping to hold him accountable for the life he had taken. Though no amount of money could bring Layla back, the settlement helped them find some closure, and for the first time in years, they were able to mourn her properly. The media attention surrounding her death, and the trial that followed, brought Layla's story into the public consciousness. And though it couldn't undo the damage done, it allowed her to be seen for the woman she truly was, not just the wife of a powerful businessman, but a woman who had struggled, who had suffered, and who had, in the end, been betrayed by those she loved most. In the broader scope, the crime and its aftermath raised important questions about power, morality, and justice. The world had watched as Kamil's fall from grace unfolded, and in many ways, it served as a reflection of society's obsession with wealth and status. The public had been complicit in his rise, but they were just as quick to condemn him once his true nature was exposed. The case highlighted the fragility of power, the way in which it could corrupt and destroy, and how easily the mighty could fall. Kamil's story was a cautionary tale, but it was also a mirror, reflecting back at society its own values, its own complicity in the rise of men like him. The theme of morality was never more apparent than in the contrast between Kamil and Omar. Kamil, whose wealth and influence had allowed him to manipulate and control, was ultimately undone by his own actions. His desire for power, his need to possess, had led him down a path of destruction. Omar, on the other hand, while not entirely blameless, had been a victim of his own emotions. His obsession with Layla, and his inability to let go of the past, had led him to make choices that, in hindsight, were nothing short of catastrophic. Both men, in their own ways, were prisoners of their own desires, and in the end, their lives were destroyed by the very forces they had sought to control. The crime also forced a reckoning with the societal expectations placed on women, particularly in cultures where wealth and power dictate much of life's structure. Layla, in her struggle to reconcile her love for Omar with the life she had built with Kamil, was a victim of the very system that celebrated her husband's success. She had been trapped in a gilded cage, her every move scrutinized, her every action controlled. Her death, tragic and senseless, was a reflection of the harsh reality that many women face when they are caught between the demands of loyalty, love, and survival. In the end, the crime had profound implications not just for those directly involved, but for society as a whole. It exposed the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of wealth and power, the toxic dynamics that could destroy lives, and the complex, often contradictory nature of human behavior. It served as a reminder that no one, no matter how rich, no matter how powerful, is invincible, and that the choices we make, no matter how small, can have far-reaching consequences.